January 17th, 1943, at 20,000 feet over the gray North Sea. Inside that small aluminium tube, the cold is so severe that it stings any exposed flesh, and the wind is a bone-biting whisper through the rhythm of 4 propellers. A patchwork of clouds floats in shadow below, while the night sky above is a never-ending pitch. The stench of oil, perspiration, and gun barrel grease mingles with half-cooked rations inside the fuselage. With flak exploding far ahead and motors whirring, the guys are strapped into their stations, puffs of black smoke hugging the outlines of enemy land. The distant sound of anti-aircraft volleys somewhere in the darkness. The Memphis Belle continues her 10th of 25 missions as it pushes forward into enemy skies in the midst of the thin roar. The weight of what lies ahead causes the crew to count minutes rather than hours that night, as the bomber soars towards its objective. Like a thin thread tying them between life and death, each propeller orbit feels both magical and perilous. The European daylight bombing campaign's risk calculation must be understood before one can appreciate the significance of this mission. By 1943, the 8th Air Force was conducting increasingly daring operations throughout occupied Europe and Nazi Germany. The idea was straightforward. Strategic bombing could demoralize the enemy, destroy German industry, and open the door for a land invasion. However, the price was high. Bomber aircrew were aware of the likelihood that many would not make it through more than a few sorties. Completing even 5 flights was safe as gambling with loaded dice, according to several seasoned airmen. The U.S. Army Air Forces defined a full combat tour as 25 missions. If you reach that threshold, you may possibly go home, freed from that never-ending cycle of death. The B17 Flying Fortress. Memphis Belle entered that deadly bet. She was a B-17F version, built in 1942 with serial number 41 Fondwartriturtios Imuntuan Sinanfortrition 224485. It was equipped with 10 tritoners, 9 ton caliber machine guns, and could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs for short-range operations, although in practice, crews typically carried lesser loads to conserve range. History of Memphis. She could strike deep into Europe thanks to her operating range, which was essential as Allied bombing theory developed. History of Memphis. The sky was a perilous sea for a crew of bombers. Fighter interceptors roared out of clouds, flak cannons squatted in enemy territory, and mechanical failure, frozen hydraulics, faulty spark plugs, damaged control surfaces, always threatened to desert you. However, crews volunteered for an illusionary mission, believing that the war could be won from the air and that precision bombing would somehow lessen civilian losses. Bombs straying, entire formations being attacked, engines ablaze, bombs missing their objectives, troops killed, and planes crippled were all examples of how frequently that perception clashed with reality. By overcoming those odds, the Memphis Belle and her crew would go on to become legendary. Their story, however, is not one of chance. Rather, it is one of discipline, solidarity, and a growing comprehension of what it meant to fight for freedom in the face of fire and steel. Memphis Belle flew her first combat mission, hitting Brest, France, in early November 1942. Wikipedia. The crew would conduct missions against heavily fortified targets such as Ham, Rouen, Lille, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire in the ensuing months. Wikipedia. Every mission left scars. Injured gunners, wounded pride, flak shards shredding control wires, and bullet holes in the fuselage skin. Over time, the Belle's 9 engines were replaced, its wings were replaced, and its tail surfaces were rebuilt. History of Memphis. Nevertheless, she continued to fly. The Luftwaffe pilots and German defenders anticipated that any heavy bomber caught in the middle of the day would be destroyed by flak or fighters. They expected mechanical frailty, surprise, and numerical superiority to tip the scales. Many Luftwaffe pilots said that bomber crews were low-grade fanatics who would swiftly lose numbers, and that convoys of bombers would disintegrate under fire. They anticipated that under strain, the bomber stream would fragment, decelerate, and falter. Pilot Robert K. Morgan, co-pilot James Varinas, and later substitutes, navigator Charles Layton, bombardier Vincent Evans, radio operator Robert Hansen, top turret gunners, ball turret gunners, waist gunners, and tail gunners made up the 10-member crew that they had not expected. The heart remained, but some rotations changed. As stated in National Museum d'Auefer Mill, the crew of the Belle experienced terror on a daily basis, so they anticipated it. However, they also anticipated mutual assistance, mission discipline, formation flying, and the need to continue even in the face of iced coolant lines, sputtering motors, or scorched hydraulic lines. Memphis Belle returned from multiple missions with control losses or burning engines, yet she was kept together by her mechanics and guts. History of Memphis. An iconic occasion came in May 1943. The crew of the Belle concluded their 25th combat mission on May 17 above Lorient, France. The website thisdayinaviation.com fortil, although May 17th is most frequently observed, other sources indicate May 19th as the completion date. The website thisdayinaviation.com. After its crew completed 25 sorties, the Belle became the first heavy bomber of the 8th Air Force to return to the United States. The National Museum, MIL-5, technically, Hell's Angels flew additional missions after completing 25 missions earlier in May 1943, but they did not return to the United States right away. The Geek Club for Aviation. The Allied headquarters was aware of the importance of that milestone. For a long time, the 25-mission threshold has been a psychological obstacle. The U.S. Army Air Forces need a symbol for propaganda and morale notes, proof that every young crew could survive beyond mortal boundaries. To make the war more relatable to the American people, they decided to use the Memphis Belle for a widely reported war bond tour. National Museum, 8th Mill. On June 8, 1943, the Belle and her crew made their way back to the United States, traveling through 31 towns as part of the war bond tour. Wikipedia. Following that, Morgan and his crew were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. TOW National Archives. However, the bravery was accompanied by a terrible metamorphosis. The Belle was a war-christened aircraft that landed in the United States. Her skins had mismatched metal, rivet scars, and replacement panels. They rebuilt her systems. Her crew had aged over the past few months. Their hands were steady, their eyes haunted, and their morale was brittle but determined. Nonetheless, the symbolic impact was significant. A flying fortress had penetrated the enemy's heart and survived. Not because she was unbeatable, but rather because troops had faith in one another, in discipline, and in training. The Belle's survival started to change the rules. In order to give crews a fighting chance, commanders recognized that attrition might be decreased, not completely eliminated, by tighter escort, stronger fighter cover, night suppression, better formation tactics, and more robust mechanical maintenance. Behind the scenes, during the war bond tour, the Belle carried that emblematic item of American plenty: a loaf of bread. Chat, the pilot would frequently walk to a nearby bakery, purchase a freshly baked loaf, and break the ice between the crew and the locals when the crew arrived in a Midwestern town for a rally. Their stories of home, plenty, and the place that soldiers battled to return to became replete with references to the aroma of freshly baked bread, the thick golden crust, and the warmth of that loaf contrasted silently with the gunmetal and frigid aluminium of battle. The belle who had come into contact with enemy flak belts would spread the picture of bread throughout American industry and auditoriums. That bread came to represent democracy's promise of plenty and life after fire and tin. The Memphis Belle's rise to fame must have been painful for the Germans. They were able to interpret symbols. They anticipated that every crew member would be killed, and every bomber would be a target. However, the Americans had now started a narrative of resolution and invincibility, claiming that a bomber could become a national hero, and that both fear and optimism would be used to sell war bonds. The fight of propaganda would get more intense. On a deeper level, that excursion changed the crew's perspective on their duty on the Belle. They evolved into morale boosters rather than just soldiers in a machine. They encountered mothers, school children, and factory workers. The distinction between a national symbol and a bomber crew became hazy. As requests and accolades poured in, the crew's cohesiveness changed. The stress of representation replaced the peace of companionship. However, this change came at a price. Not every crew member had flown every mission. Some flew portions of the tour on different aircraft. As stated in National Museum Afert Mill, they were burdened by the demands of going home as a symbol, a yearning for everyday life mixed uncomfortably with nostalgia for the brutal brotherhood of combat. However, the Belle's legend persisted. The Altitude Memphis Belle Jaubrice was preserved in the decades following the war, but it was neglected until restoration efforts brought it back to life. In May 2018, the aircraft was unveiled in her 1943 wartime livery after being disassembled and sent to the U.S. Air Force's National Museum in Ohio in 2005. Wikipedia. Reminders of sacrifice can be seen in her gun turrets, patched fuselage, and wood-grain interior spines. The National Museum A. Mill Fee. She turned into a museum exhibit, a patriotic artifact, and a tangible link between the urgency of war and introspection during peacetime. Beyond that, though, her story still illustrates a greater reality. Civilizations with plenty rely not only on physical prowess, but also on a shared belief in principles like democracy, freedom, and abundance over scarcity. The 25 missions of the Belle were a moral compass as well as a technical achievement. It was necessary to demonstrate to the American imagination that the risk of war might result in national confidence, that a bomber crew could live and return victorious, and that their country's principles were at stake. Today's visitor sees more than just metal and rivets when they stand in front of the repaired Belle. They see the bread loaf that has been transformed into a symbol of home and plenty, of what was fought for and what needs to be protected. Even if the bomber is no longer in flight, its legacy endures. The Belle sleeps in the quiet silence of a museum hangar. A faint prop blade stirring, distant motors, or a recollected roar in the silence can all be heard if one listens carefully. That sound endures, a reminder that freedom is not gained in silence and that plenty, once experienced, necessitates constant protection. Therefore, the Memphis Belle's true narrative goes beyond the remarkable survival of a bomber crew on 25 missions. They did this by changing the way people thought about survival and confirming that the promise of democracy outweighed every flak burst, broken engine, and exhausted breath in the chilly skies over Europe. That promise, the loaf, the representation of home, remains for us as a reminder that freedom necessitates watchfulness. Abundance is brittle, and the bravery of a few can become the hope of many.